Hey everybody. In this lecture, we're going to start talking about rock and roll in the 1950s, its origins, some of the sound, and how it relates to other things that were going on in 1950s America. So let's get into that. First place to start is the relatively boring nature of late 40s, early 1950s American popular music from the perspective of teenagers. Okay, don't get me wrong. There's some really amazing music from the late 40s, early 1950s. But in terms of popular music that teenagers were going to be interested in, kind of a dead period. After World War II, World War II ends in 1945. That brought about an end to the swing era of American music. From roughly 1935 to 1945, big band jazz was popular. Swing music was popular. And with the end of World War II, came an end to the popularity of swing music. Almost overnight, that swing generation grew up, got married, started having kids, and these were the parents of that baby boom generation that we all hear so much about. And with the end of the swing era, there was an end to this boom in popular dance music. And there was something of a vacuum for a number of years, skipping ahead until the rise of rock and roll that we're going to get into. But the late 40s, early 50s was something of a boring period of time. One of the songs I have you listen to in this module is Patti Page's song, That Doggy in the Window. There's the album cover for it right there. And you'll listen to that and you'll understand what I'm talking about in terms of boring popular music during this period of time. And so teenagers were looking for something a bit more lively, interesting, better to be listening to, something you could really dance to. Now, in the old days when you had radios with dials on them, the most sought after radio stations for broadcasters were in the middle of the radio dial. And that was because of probability. As a person would turn the dial to try and find a song to listen to, chances were better that you were going to go through the middle of the dial. And before long, come to find a song that you would like to listen to. Right? And so the most valuable radio stations were those that were closer to the middle of the radio dial. Way out at the ends of the radio dial is where you would find less valuable radio stations, more inexpensive, more niche marketing, Christian radio stations. Think of it today. It's still the same way today. Look at the end of the radio dial. Today, what do you find? Christian radio stations, public broadcasting, jazz stations, maybe some more obscure foreign language radio stations. That's because those were less valuable, because chances are you found a song that you liked or something you wanted to listen to before you got to the end of the dial. So if you wanted to buy a radio station, you would rather not get one of those end of the dial stations. Why would you get one of those end of the dial? Because they were really cheap, and that's all you could afford. Well, back in the 1940s, 1950s, at the end of the radio dial, one of the stations you would find were stations that were dedicated towards the African American market. These were stations for African Americans, smaller population, less demand. That's where you would get. Well, what was happening in the late 40s and particularly the early 1950s as teenagers, white, brown, black, were looking for more interesting music to listen to. Particularly white kids that were less familiar with black radio stations were finding interesting songs at the end of the dial, at these African American radio stations that were there. And these stations were largely playing what was known at the time as rhythm and blues. Okay, what was rhythm and blues? Rhythm and blues was a marketing category that ultimately meant black music for black people. Back in the 1920s was where you got the first interest in the music industry and trying to capture the African American buying public, as we've already talked about. There's always been a lot of white interest in black music. And this discussion of rock and roll is a continuation of something we've already talked about quite a bit, between minstrel shows and then 1920s jazz. The history of rock and roll is a continuation of white fascination with black music. But in the 1920s, there was a growing recognition in the music industry that African Americans have money and want music directed towards themselves. And so you got the first sort of significant marketing to the black audience in the industry. And so in the 1920s, this category came to be known as race music. What did race music mean? Race music meant black music for black people. And during the 1920s, this had a positive connotation to it. There was this idea within the African American community of people that were a credit to the African American community, known as race men. Particularly thought in terms of masculine terms, that some man that was doing a lot for the community or was garnering respect outside of the African American community was known as a race man. He was somebody to be proud of. So when the music industry, largely controlled by white folk, wanted to come up for a category of black music for black people, they used the term race music. By the time we're getting to the late 40s, this idea of race music no longer sounded good. It no longer, that connection to that positive connotation of the 1920s was losing its way. And so the industry looked to a different way to categorize black music for black people. And they came up with the category of rhythm and blues. Rhythm and blues, it meant the same thing. It meant black music for black people. All right? But what was happening in the late 40s also is that non-black American teenagers, bored with a lot of the popular music that was available in the middle of the radio dial, were looking further and further away to find something interesting to listen to. And they were finding rhythm and blues, black music that was originally thought to be of interest only to African Americans. Okay. The origins of rock and roll is in rhythm and blues. Okay. Rock and roll was not a unique style of music. It was not a unique sound. It was a marketing category. Okay. So often the genres of music, that the labels we apply to types of music, often don't have very much to do with the actual sound of the music, but rather a way to market to particular groups of Americans. And so we'll talk about where the name rock and roll comes from in a second here. The idea of rhythm and blues was a sort of catch-all category that included lots of different styles of African American music, gospel, blues, a cappella, after the decline of swing, there was sort of smaller style jazz bands known as jump bands that would be very influential on later rock and roll. But the category meant black music for black people. Now, where does this category of sort of rock and roll and the marketing of this music comes from? Well, that's where we need to start talking about one person in particular, a man by the name of Alan Freed. Alan Freed was a disc jockey in Cleveland, Ohio, and in the late 40s, early 1950s, actually had a classical music show. But Freed had a drinking buddy in Cleveland that owned a record store. And his drinking buddy that owned this record store was having a conversation with Freed one day and told Freed that something interesting was going on in his record store. He was getting more and more white kids that were walking into his record store and asking where the rhythm and blues section was. Okay, again, these were probably a lot of these kids that were bored by the music in the middle of the dial, the Patti Page style Doggy in the Window, late 40s, early 1950s pop music. And we're looking for something more interesting and more lively. And we're finding interesting stuff at the end of the dial at African American radio stations playing rhythm and blues. And this record store owner was telling Freed, this is, there's something interesting going on. There's some sort of changing musical taste going on. Now, this intrigued Freed. Disc jockeys like musicians, particularly back in the old days, where disc jockeys had a lot more freedom to program what kind of records they wanted to play. Disc jockeys like performers want to get famous. They want to make a lot of money. And so Freed, interested in the latest perhaps trend going on, went to his station manager and asked about putting on a rhythm and blues radio station. Freed's station was largely thought of in terms of a white radio station. And so this would be a bit novel. And his station manager allowed him to put on a late night weekend show that Freed would call the Moondog House, and where he would play African American rhythm and blues records. And the show was a massive hit. And it was Freed who was the first one to call this rhythm and blues music rock and roll. Why did he do that? He did it to try and make it safe for his largely white audience to like this music. There just would have been a certain percentage of white teenagers who were listening to this music. The real hardcore hipsters, they understood the black nature of the music. They were okay with the black nature of this music. But as the genre was going to grow, there would have been more milder, more timid white teenagers who might have been a bit scared off by a genre of music that was known as an African American style of music. And sort of knowing that this sort of confusion or awkward nature might be an issue, Freed simply started calling this music rock and roll. Now, he didn't coin the terminology rock and roll in the general sense. Rock and roll had been used since at least the 1930s to describe characteristics of sound. An old swing song that was really good and had a great rhythm to it, people would say, oh, like that song rocks, that song rolls. But it was Freed who created the idea of rock and roll as a category of music. That as a sort of marketing label for this new style of music. So when we start talking about rock and roll, we're not talking about a new sound of music, just a new way of marketing that music, largely to make white teenagers feel more safe in listening to this music. Right? The success of this show would eventually take Alan Freed to New York City to a much bigger radio station. He would start promoting concerts. He starred in some movies around this growing popularity of rock and roll. Right? So by the time we get to 1953, 1954, rock and roll is a phenomenon. That maybe brings us to Elvis Presley to talk about that. Elvis Presley was not the first rock and roller. There were other rock and rollers that were famous before Elvis. However, Elvis was the person that took rock and roll to an entirely new level of popularity. He would be the one that would garner new interest from areas of the entertainment industry that had largely been ignoring rock and roll up until this point. Rock and roll had largely been popular on small little independent record labels. The major record labels in the early 1950s, RCA Victor, Decca, the newly created Capitol Records, Columbia Records, they had largely been ignoring rock and roll. They just, to the larger record labels, rock and roll seemed like a kid's fad, a teenage fad that was going to go away before they could even really heavily get interested in the style of music. And so they didn't pay much attention to it. Elvis was going to change that. Elvis's massive popularity was going to convince the major labels, also television, also movies, to get interested in rock and roll. There's a kind of sweet story that's, it's not false, but it's often incomplete. You'll hear about the discovery of Elvis Presley. Elvis Presley was living with his family in Memphis, Tennessee in the early 1950s. He just graduated from high school and had taken a job as a truck driver. Elvis's mom, his mom's birthday was coming up, and Elvis wanted to do something for his mom for her birthday. So there was a place in Memphis where you could make you could record one song and have it pressed on one record. It was a place called Sun Records. And Elvis walked in and recorded a song for his mom for her birthday and gave it to her birthday. Now, the owner of Sun Records, a man by the name of Sam Phillips, was not there at the time, but the secretary was there at the time, and she heard Elvis sing. And she had remembered hearing Sam say, if he could just find a white boy that sang like a black man, he would be a millionaire. And when the secretary heard Elvis sing, she thought he sounded like a black man. He was a white man who sounded like a black man. And so she told Sam Phillips all about this. Eventually, Phillips got in touch with Elvis, told him to come back in, and the rest would become history. I'll talk maybe a little bit more about that history in a second. It's a sweet story. The problem with it is that it makes it sound all too accidental in terms of discovery. Yes, Elvis made a record for his mom for her birthday, and he did give it to her. However, he was hoping to be discovered by Sun Records. See, Sun Records was one of these independent rhythm and blues recording companies. People came from all over the South to get discovered at Sun Records. And Elvis knew this, and Elvis wanted to be discovered, and he wanted to make records. He didn't want to be a truck driver his whole life. He wanted to be a famous singer. And so the only problem with that story is there's just more to it than you usually hear. It makes the discovery of Elvis sound like this big accident, like had it not been for this accident of fate, Elvis would have been driving a truck for his whole life. No, he would have still been trying to find ways to get discovered and become famous. Well, eventually, a few weeks later, Elvis and Sam Phillips would get together and they would try to start recording some songs. And it wasn't working at first because just, I don't know, Sam Phillips wasn't hearing anything. He wasn't hearing anything he liked, and they kept trying different songs, and eventually they took a little break, and Elvis and the band during this break were still like noodling around and playing and doing some little things, and Elvis started to sing an older rhythm and blues song called "That's All Right, Mama." And when Sam Phillips heard that, he's like, "That's the song. That's the hit." And Elvis was a little surprised. He's like, "What? That's just an old rhythm and blues song. What, like everybody knows that song. Why are we going to do it?" And Sam Phillips is like, "No, that's the song. That's the hit." And so the first record, a two-sided record, one side was "That's All Right, Mom," and the other side is Blue Moon of Kentucky. And both would become hits, but "That's All Right, Mama" was the big hit that would go on. I've got that for you to listen to in the module also, for those of you that might not be familiar with the song. Now, one of the reasons for Elvis's extraordinary popularity was because of the whiteness of his skin. We talked about this quite a bit already, that the broader white American audience was more comfortable receiving African American music in white guises. Going back 100 years before to minstrel shows, this was, white people literally blackening up their faces to perform black music. By the time we get 100 years later to the 1950s, blackface was no longer required. But white performers that played rock and roll music tended to have more success. There were some black rock and roll performers that made the transition from rhythm and blues to rock and roll. Little Richard would be a good example. Going back to an earlier slide, one of the reasons I picked this picture for this slide is this was Ruth Brown. Ruth Brown was a rhythm and blues performer that was very popular. But Ruth Brown never really made the transition to a rock and roller. And the last thing we're going to talk about is the connection, or really the disconnection, between rock and roll and female performers. That female performers didn't seem to really get accepted in the world of early rock and roll. And so some rhythm and blues performers made the transition to rock and roll. Little Richard would be an example of one that did. Ruth Brown, unfortunately, is an example of one that did not. But white rock and roll performers just had more opportunities. The white audience was more comfortable with white performers. At least some of the white audience was more comfortable with white performers. They had more opportunities on television. They had more opportunities in outside marketing. People like Elvis Presley would get movie roles that just weren't going to be available for African American performers. And there's a great story about sort of the marketing of Elvis Presley and whiteness in terms of that first record that was a hit for Elvis. So That's All Right, Mama. Sam Phillips, the owner of Sun Records, just knew in his bones this is going to be a hit. So he went around to all the local radio stations in Memphis that might play the song to try and get them to do so. And one station liked the record and started playing it immediately. And back in these times, it sounds crazy to us today, but this is the way they would do it in the 1950s, is if a song was popular and people were calling in to request the song, they would just keep playing the same song again and again. As long as the phone was ringing, they'd just keep playing it. And they kept playing this Elvis song. So many people loved it. So many people liked it. They just kept playing the song again. And so the DJ understood that Elvis was a local kid. And so he said over the radio, hey, Elvis, if you're listening, come on by the station. I'm sure people would love to hear from you. Well, of course, Elvis was listening. He knew what was going on. And so he immediately got to the radio station to be interviewed. And one of the first questions that was asked, that the DJ asked was, Elvis, the DJ said something along the lines of, Elvis, I know you grew up here local. What high school did you go to? And Elvis told the DJ, I went to so-and-so high school. Now, was this because the DJ was super interested in the educational history of Elvis Presley? No. He was doing something more subtle. In the 40s and early 1950s, the school systems in Tennessee and Memphis were segregated. There were white schools and there were black schools. And I don't mean, mostly white, mostly black. I mean segregated. I mean white-only schools and black-only schools. And in the South, they had more subtle ways of talking about race because of the history of racism and slavery. And they just had ways of dancing around discussions of race that everybody understood, but outsiders might not understand. And this is one of those cases. What the DJ was trying to get the audience to understand was that Elvis was white. See, music is colorblind. You listen to a record on the radio, you don't know if that performer's white or that performer's black. You might think you know, maybe you don't know, but there's no way you could completely know. And so the DJ, suspecting that lots of his audience was assuming that Elvis was black, he wanted them to know Elvis was white. And Southerners wouldn't have just came right out and said, a DJ wouldn't have, no, I know a lot of you might be surprised, but Elvis here is white. No. They wouldn't talk in such a direct way. They would have a more indirect way. Everybody in Memphis knew which schools were the white schools and which schools were the black schools. So by asking Elvis what high school he went to, and when he said, I went to such and such high school, everybody listening on the radio would know, Elvis is white. And so part of Elvis's great popularity was based on the whiteness of his skin. And this opened up opportunities for making money in places other than records. And that's where we get to this slide here on Elvis and consumerism. We've talked in this popular culture unit on consumerism. As we get to the 20th century, there's more emphasis on consumerism, this idea of buying things to bring happiness. As you get more advanced capitalism and mass production, more and more the American economy is based on consumer spending. World War II ends, as I talked about before, in 1945, and this ushered in the end of World War II, massive boom in the late 40s and 1950s in consumer spending. Consumer spending almost doubles in the next 15 years that you get. And one of the increasingly large new consumer groups in America were teenagers. Okay, the Great Depression took place during the 1930s, difficult economic times. World War II comes at the tail end of the Great Depression. In fact, it's actually World War II that ultimately ends the Great Depression. And so by the end of 1945 and the end of World War II, there was a lot of pent-up consumer demand. People wanted to buy lots of stuff that they hadn't been able to buy previously. And the American economy booms during the late 40s and 1950s. This economic prosperity was not shared equally among everybody. There were still poor people. There were still depressed areas of the country. But on average, the economy was booming. And teenagers were a growing group of people that had money to spend. On the one hand, because their parents or at least some of these teenagers' parents were becoming wealthier. They had more money to kick down to their kids in terms of, allowances and things like that. But also because the economy was booming, there were more demand for jobs, and so there were more jobs available for teenagers, certainly more than there was during the Great Depression in the early period of time. And so teenagers had more money to spend. And teenagers were spending significant amount of their disposable income on music and music-related items. Just a huge percentage of this money that young people were getting. And so in 1958, you could buy 78 different Elvis Presley related products that did not include records. I'm not talking about, he had all these records and you could buy. That's not included in this 78 number. This is all non-music related things you could buy related to Elvis Presley. A lot of these things were directed toward his female fans. A young woman, a teenage girl, could spend her entire day almost saturated in Elvis Presley related goods and products. She could wake up in the morning, the first thing her eyes would see would be an Elvis Presley poster on the wall. She could push back her Elvis Presley sheets and get out of bed, take off her Elvis Presley pajamas, brush her teeth with her Elvis Presley toothbrush. Okay. Get dressed in Elvis Presley related clothing, Elvis Presley pedal pushers, an Elvis Presley blouse with a monogrammed E script on her shirt to let everybody know she was an Elvis fan. Get to school, open up her Elvis Presley notebook, take notes with her Elvis Presley pencil. If she was a little thirsty at school, she could drink an Elvis Presley cola. When it came time to reapply her makeup, she had 3 different shades of Elvis Presley lipstick. That's the image right here that you have in this slide for lipstick. There was Tutti Frutti red and Hound Dog orange. I forget the third color you could get. And so if she wanted to write a note to one of her friends at school, she could do so with her Elvis Presley stationery, and so on, and so on, and so on for the rest of the day until she got back in bed, pushed back over her body her Elvis Presley sheets. And the last thing she would see at the end of the night before she closed her eyes was her Elvis Presley poster. You want to talk about consumerism? You want to talk about the idea of buying things to bring happiness? Rock and roll, just like we talked about jazz in the 1920s, jazz is a consumer item. Rock and roll was very much a consumer item, and there's no better way to understand the connections between rock and roll and consumerism than the example of Elvis Presley. Okay, let's talk about one more thing related to rock and roll in the 1950s, and that's the relative absence of women from rock and roll. Often when we learn about rock and roll, whether in popular culture and academic settings, we can often hear about the kind of revolutionary nature of rock and roll, this youth revolt that we get with rock and roll. But one of the ironies of this liberating effect of this new style of music was the relative absence of women involved in early rock and roll. In fact, one of the effects of rock and roll was to push female performers out of the spotlight in the early and late 1950s. Whatever energy there was to early rock and roll, it was often perceived as a kind of masculine energy. When you think of the early rock and rollers, they're almost exclusively male. Elvis Presley, Little Richard, Chuck Berry, Johnny Cash, Carl Perkins, Buddy Holly, Richie Valens, the Big Bopper, Bill Haley and the Comets, almost all male. You got to be a pretty hard rock and roll nerd to know the history to find some early female performers. One is right here. Wanda Jackson, the queen of rockabilly. I have a song for you again. I have another video with her performing on it. But Wanda Jackson's stay in in the history of rock and roll was kind of short-lived. She was treated as something, as a novelty. She was marketed as the female Elvis Presley. You can almost see a similarity in her appearance. She almost looks like she could have been Elvis's sister, and that was part of the realization by marketing that, oh, we can market her like a female Elvis Presley. But her interest in her music started to wane, and over time she would transition towards country music, and that would be her move. One of the things that's interesting is often the history of early rock and roll from the 1950s to the 1960s, is taught almost like the way we used to teach the history of modern Western civilization. Classical age, Dark Ages, the Renaissance. All right? We don't really teach Western civilization like this anymore. There's lots of problems with that categorization, particularly the idea of a Dark Ages. And there's kind of an interesting parallel in the history of the history of rock and roll and the way people have interpreted the history of early rock and roll. There's often been this categorization of a classical age, a dark age, and then a Renaissance. The classical age was the rock and roll of the 1950s. All those performers I just listed off there. But by 1959, almost all the early rock and rollers were either done, dead, or on something of an extended hiatus. By 59, Elvis was in the Army. Little Richard had abandoned rock and roll for a while to go to Bible college. He was conflicted about the tension between rock and roll and his religious convictions. Also his sexual orientation was probably an issue he was struggling with at the time. Ritchie Valens had died in a plane crash. Buddy Holly had died in that same plane crash. Chuck Berry was going to jail basically for the offense of dating a white woman. That was basically the crime he was accused of. Johnny Cash was transitioning to country music. One way or another, a lot of the that was the end. By 59, it was the end of this classical era of American rock and roll. I'm going to skip to the Renaissance. By 1964, there was a Renaissance where people have interpreted rock and roll got real good again. And in fact, they start calling it rock to differentiate this. What's special about the year 1964? That's the Beatles. That's when the Beatles arrived from England, and along with the Beatles, other British bands, this British Invasion, the Rolling Stones, the Who, these types of bands. And this is supposed to be the rejuvenation. The period from 59 to 64 is often treated as a kind of dark ages. Why was this interpreted by many people as a dark ages? This is the period of the history of rock and roll where women actually did get some traction. This is the era of the girl groups, the Supremes, the Shangri-Las, the Ronettes. This is the time from the very late 50s to the early 1960s where female rock and rollers were dominating the music charts. Later generations of rock critics and rock historians have looked down upon this period. This is changing now. People are really starting to appreciate how good the era of the girl groups were, and the music from this period is amazing. But that kind of resistance to female rock and rollers outside of the period is pretty evident. We don't treat, in terms of history, the Middle Ages as a Dark Ages anymore, because it really wasn't in terms of history. It actually wasn't a benighted dark age. Nor should we treat the period of 1959 to 1963, 64 as a dark ages of the history of rock and roll as a dark ages either, because it wasn't a dark ages. There was all kinds of amazing music that just happened to be made by women during this time. But, part of that history of early rock and roll is a kind of history where it was hard for women to get accepted in rock and roll. The kind of energy that you saw with performers like Elvis Presley on stage swinging his hips, or Chuck Berry duck walking with his guitar. It was hard for women during this period of the 1950s to get away with that kind of, aggressive, masculine energy. There just wasn't a sense that the public would accept female performers like that. So we didn't get a lot of female rock and rollers. Somebody like Wanda Jackson is almost the exception that proves the rule. Okay, everybody, that's it for this lecture. I'll see you next time.